Welcome to the Far and Beyond podcast, hosted by the Contracts and Fiscal Law Department at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. This podcast is for the federal government attorneys navigating the complex intersection of acquisitions and fiscal law and policy. I am your host, Major Ellie Sewell.
I'm Major Jason Floyd.
And I'm Major Hyun Muniz.
Today we're talking about something exciting. We're talking about other transaction authorities, or OTAs. To be honest, when I first heard the term OTAs, or even other transactions, I thought we were just talking about, some random way we can do a contract, like a FAR-based one that you never hear about, like reversed auction or something. It kind of blew my mind when they were like, no, it's not even with the FAR.
I feel that because when I first heard it, I was like, I tuned back into like the Star Wars, like these are not the droids you're looking for, like these are the other transactions, right? We all know the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, covers all these other things and has lots of requirements that go into it. What I don't specifically know is what goes into and what's covered by OTAs. I sort of think of it as like the Wild West of government contracting.
I really just want to sing the Wild Wild West song by Will Smith right now. Going straight to the Wild Wild West.
Oh, okay.
Oh, God. Ed, I need you. Ed, bring back Pirates of the Caribbean.
Okay, so it's not quite the Wild West. There's not as many rules, right? But there are still rules. And on top of that, you want to think of OTAs as a specialized tool in our acquisition kit designed specifically for innovation.
So innovation is a great buzzword. I feel like we're hearing it a lot these days being thrown around. But as a lawyer, I need to know what actually is an OTA. A gift, a secret handshake.
You know what? Let's start with what it's not, Ellie, and it is not a secret handshake.
Wait. So I don't feel left out now because it's not a secret handshake.
There is a secret handshake. There's just not one for OTAs. So
okay,
sorry, Jason. You're still not quite in the inner circle. Let's start with again what it is not. It's an OTA is not a federal procurement contract, not a grant or a cooperative agreement.
Right, and because it's not either of those things, that's what means it's not subject to the FAR, right? Like those are the requirements, those are the things that are subject to the FAR.
So wait, if it's not subject to the FAR, does that mean there are no rules? Like, are we just handing out bags of cash to, your tech startups in Silicon Valley?
Well, I wish it were that simple. Yeah, I wish it were that simple, or maybe not, right? It's not subject to the FAR, but it is a legally binding agreement. It is still subject to fiscal law, criminal statute, the Procurement Integrity Act. However, it is exempt from the Competition and Contracting Act, the Contract Disputes Act, and cost accounting standards.
So to understand why we have this, I think you got to go back to, 1957? The Soviet Union launching Sputnik, which is the world's first satellite, right?
Exactly. The U.S. realized modern warfare depended on rocket technology and shifted the arms race to the space race. This led to the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, which created NASA and gave them the very first authority to use other transactions. Congress basically said, the current procurement rules, they're just not fast enough for us to keep up in this space race. We need to put a man on the moon, and we need to do it through some other means, right? Other transactions.
Would you say that we needed something to move at light speed? Oh, NASA.
I like it. Keep it.
Live long and prosper, Jason. So it started with the space race. But now I hear the Department of War is the big player.
Right. Since NASA, Congress has granted OTA authority to 11 federal agencies, including the Department of War. Over the years, NDAs have codified and expanded this from just research into prototypes and even follow-on production.
Okay, so we have the authority, but why use it? Why not just stick to a regular FAR-based contract?
To me, I think doesn't it boil down to the government being a difficult customer, right, Hyun? If for example, I'm a new tech company in Silicon Valley and I just want to sell my product, I don't want to have to hire a team of accountants just to comply with specialized cost accounting standards or specialized government invoicing systems. Isn't that really what it comes down to?
It's exactly that. The government, with all its specialized rules and accounting systems, they are a lot harder to work with, especially compared to just the private sector out there. The primary goal of OTAs is to work with those innovative private sector entities who traditionally do not work with the government. We call them non-traditional defense contractors, or NDCs.
So how do we define who is an NDC? Is it just anyone who thinks the government is sort of difficult to work with?
Legally, the basic definition of NDC is just an entity that has not performed for at least 1 year period preceding the solicitation. Legally, an NDC is an entity that has not performed for at least a 1 year period preceding the solicitation, any contract or subcontract for the Department of War that is subject to the full cost accounting standards coverage.
And we attract them by offering less regulation in this context, right? Like the ability to negotiate IP or intellectual property terms, and a process that sort of mimics the private sector business dealings. So in a procurement contract, the regulation, the FAR, DFARs, or whatever your supplement is, that's what controls the terms that go into that contract. But in an OT, we negotiate the terms.
So less regulation, but more negotiation.
Exactly.
All right, Hien. You mentioned there are 3 different types of OTAs. If I'm an attorney reviewing a package, what am I looking at?
Right, so 3 different types. First is the research OT. This is for basic, applied, and advanced research projects. The goal here is testing and validation. One key requirement is the resource sharing, where the government's share generally shouldn't exceed 50%.
So Hyun, this is like sort of when we're not really aiming for a deliverable product. We just want to say, hey, here's some issues that we're seeing, and maybe like some sort of advanced GPS device could solve the problem, but we need more research first to just figure out how the technology behind that device will work and maybe advance the science behind it. Is that what we're talking about here?
Exactly. Like, say, for example, looking into microelectronics and more of their capabilities or something along those lines, either for DOW requirement or whatever agency is trying to look into them. In a research OT, you have this dual benefit where it's not necessarily something that where it's just going to benefit the military. It's also going to benefit whatever private entity is working with you.
Okay, so then what is the second type?
The second type, so this is the prototype OT. These are for projects directly relevant to enhancing mission effectiveness of personnel or improving platforms and systems.
So enhancing mission effectiveness, that sounds like a very broad legal hook.
Exactly that. Congress expanded that definition. Originally, it was for weapons, and they expanded it because they want to increase OT usage, right?
So to follow on to the example I gave earlier, once the science behind advancing GPS technology is solidified, now we want to build a prototype of that GPS device, right? And so this is when we would use a prototype OT. And maybe we already did a research OT, or maybe we didn't, right? We don't have to use these together or at all, right? We could just jump straight to a prototype OT. Is that right, Hyun?
Right. So you don't necessarily have to have a research OT before a prototype OT. They don't have to go hand in hand together. But once you have the prototype OT, then there's a possibility to do a production OT, right? That streamlines it. This is called the follow-on agreement. As long as that first prototype OT was competitively awarded, successfully completed, then you can award a prototype OT without competition.
So CICA doesn't apply. What does it mean by competitively awarded, though?
So competition is not going to be the same competition, right, we see in CICA and then the FAR-based procurement contracts. Congress hasn't specified exactly what competition is in regards to OTs itself. The big thing is you do know that if you do a production OT, you need some kind of written justification saying it was competitively awarded. So you at least need enough to write down that this was competitively awarded, and then justification that follows that. A lot of it isn't super too removed, I think, from the competition you see, right? There's a basic evaluation and selection that you would see, and based on certain merits or whatnot, it's just, like I said, not as restrictive, or doesn't have to be exactly the same as you see for FAR-based procurements.
That sounds like a big win for companies, going from a prototype straight to a production contract without having to do a new fight and go through that competition process.
Yes, massive incentive. It streamlines the whole process.
And some agencies do have sort of a defined process, even if Congress hasn't told us what that process looks like. I think one of the more famous one is like the CSO out of DIU, right? They do this commercial solutions opening where they sort of like take pitches, for example, right? And I know that's oversimplified, but just that's the flavor of competition, right?
It's totally Shark Tank style. Absolutely.
Oh, fantastic.
Right? Listen, people, there's a solicitation for an OT. It's kind of unbounded, right? We don't have the same rules. There are no rules, right? No, there are rules, but you can go the traditional way for OTs where they submit written proposals, or you could have it the panel style, like kind of how you mentioned, basically Shark Tank, where they come in, the contractors come in, the NDCs come in, and they do these pitches. They can do live demonstrations. There's no restrictions, right?
That sounds fantastic and really flexible.
Creativity is kind of the key in OTs.
Okay, so let's talk about the actual process. As a government attorney, my acquisition team usually involves a contracting officer. Is that the same here?
So for OTAs, are you guys ready for this jump, right? Instead of a KO, we have an AO. It's an agreements officer, right? So big difference. While KO, they're going to be navigating the FAR. The AO, though, on the other side, it's more critical for them to use best business judgment, creative thinking, and have negotiation skills.
Who is an AO? Is it someone in the contracting officer? Could it be a KO? Or is it someone like in the requirements office?
I think it's common to see a KO potentially jump to being appointed as an AO because they have some kind of experience. There are no specific requirements listed for what is an agreements officer, how the warrant levels are obtained, or anything like any kind of formality that you see for KOs. They kind of leave it up to the individual agencies.
So Hyun, what about the solicitation? Do you just like post it on a bulletin board in like a dark hallway and some secret agent comes up and like responds, or how does this work?
We can advertise anywhere, right? You can do sam.gov. But remember, the whole point is to reach out to non-traditional contractors, and non-traditional contractors don't necessarily look on sam.gov. So it's really, this is where the creative thinking comes in. It's where whatever avenue we think we can use to reach them, whether it's social media, direct emails, phone calls.
So because SECA isn't in play, we aren't worried about talking to companies directly.
Exactly.
Okay, but here is where the attorneys start sweating. Protests. So, if there's no FAR and no SECA, can a losing company protest?
Yeah, this is a big myth, right? OTs cannot be protested is sort of the drumbeat. We used to think that a long time ago. We used to hope that a while ago, right? But now we know, I think, although it is changing, that the venue jurisdiction issues are such that the COFC will take jurisdiction in some circumstances and the GAO will take jurisdiction in others. And although those are pretty limited and they're diverse based on the different statutes that apply to each of the forum's jurisdictions, right?
Right. It's a little unsettled, I would think is the word. We do know for the most part that GAO generally lacks jurisdiction over OTAs because they're not procurement contracts. But GAO will review a protest if someone claims the government improperly used its OT authority.
And that's because GAO has jurisdiction over sort of procurement contracts. And so if an agency should be using that vehicle, that's when it's going to say, oh, and that's where agency you made an error, right?
Exactly.
So for example, like Blade Strategies was a recent case where they protested the Army's use of an OTA for missile technology, but then GAO dismissed it because they waited too long to file. Interestingly, this was not a dismissal based on a lack of jurisdiction, though, right? It was sort of the standard application of GAO's timeliness rules.
So what about the Court of Federal Claims then, or COFC?
So currently, COFC, I would say, is maybe your best bet for jurisdiction. Again, listen, decisions have kind of been going a little back and forth. It's a little unsettled, so keep that in mind. The Tucker Act gives them jurisdiction over bid protests in connection with a procurement. In spaces like space exploration, the court looked at whether the OTA was connected to a future procurement. More recently, in Raytheon and Telesto Group, the court has been broadening its view, stating that it's the de facto forum for these protests.
So they can be reviewed, but the court is mostly looking at the use of the OT authority, and not necessarily the agency's internal evaluation of the prototype itself. But it also sounds like this is all subject to change.
Exactly. I wouldn't say anything is locked in yet.
Okay. This has been eye-opening. I feel woefully inadequate in my job.
Yeah.
That's, I think, is a lot of help as we move forward and talk about OTAs more, because this is an area that is getting a lot of interest. It's
Congress is promoting the increased use of OTAs.
Not just Congress too, but I think the Secretary of War has also mentioned them as well. So I think OTAs is definitely something we all need to be at least aware of, and maybe some of the ins and outs of how they operate and the processes along with OTAs, because they are different than what a lot of us are really familiar with, which is the FAR, which is a very checklist by the book process, where OTAs doesn't really have that, it seems like. Has rules.
There's some rules, but the rules encourage a lot of flexibility, creativity.
So to wrap this up, what are the final thoughts for our fellow attorneys?
Yeah, so first, for me at least, don't always assume OTs are going to be the faster way to get what you need, right? So negotiating with some of these NDCs could be hard, because just because they're non-traditional doesn't mean they're a small company. It could be a very large company that just doesn't or hasn't had a CAS-covered contract in a while. So it could take longer, right, if you're negotiating with these folks and maybe they value their IP much more than we're willing to pay. So it's going to be innovation and the access to new contractors that are really driving the train on whether to use this authority or not.
And it's not just one contractor, right? There could be several big players in this game, which also extends the timelines. And remember, OTAs are legally binding agreements. They have all those foundational elements that you see in contracts. We call them legal agreements, right? There's offer, acceptance, consideration, and then we need actual authority. We still also want competition to the maximum extent practicable. We do have some streamlining avenues for OTs, but again, that rule, using your best business judgment, do you want to exclude competition altogether? No, you still want some competition. That is where you sometimes get your best products and your prices.
So in summary, OTAs make the government a more appealing customer by mimicking private sector negotiations, what I gather, and then they require more creativity, critical thinking, and business sense than a standard procurement, because there's no FAR to hold your hand.
Exactly. If you're a government attorney, don't be afraid of OTAs, right? I know we love our rules and our guidance, but we all should have some kind of sense of best business judgment, right, to guide us at each step of the way.
Right, but we still do need to remember that these are all limited by the kind of thing we need. We either need research or we need prototyping, right?
Right.
Thank you again, Hyun, for joining us today, talking us through OTAs as we're trying to navigate this almost like a shiny new toy.
From 1950.
It seems like the shiny new toy, but you're right, Jason. It really has been around since 1950. Thank you for joining us today in this episode of Far and Beyond. Please make sure to follow us and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. We'd love to hear from our listeners. Please continue to reach out to us on Facebook and LinkedIn. The information can be found in the show notes from today's episode. The views expressed today are those of the presenters, not that of the Judge Advocate General Corps, the Department of the Army, the Department of War, or the Department of the Air Force.